Hey everybody, today we are talking about the Nikon Z8, and the questions we are going to answer are A, is this a good camera for sports? And B, is it worth buying a Nikon Z8 or just spending more money on a Z9 if you're really into sports and you have that kind of cash? Well, I'm going to tell you what. Bottom line up front, the Z8 is a good camera for sports. In fact, it's a good camera for a lot of different things. It is very close to the Z9 in a lot of different ways. However, there are some important differences that we are going to get to. But first, let's talk about, is it a good sports camera? So I don't have an extensive amount of experience with the Z8 for sports. This is actually my slow time of year. I did get to shoot a futsal game recently, and if you're not familiar with futsal, it's kind of like indoor soccer played on a basketball court that's been converted. Ball's smaller, the goals are smaller, and the ball is weighted so it doesn't fly as fast and as far. But either way, it's a pretty fast-moving game. Well, during that game, I set up my Z8 exactly how I set up my Z9s. I use the exact same settings, and the menus are extremely close to one another. There's only a few minor differences. And then I compared the results to what I normally get from my Z9. This is the bottom line. The autofocus was basically the same exact thing that I get out of my Z9. I really didn't perceive any difference. Frame rate, exactly the same. I didn't perceive any difference at all. As far as the sensor and performance at high ISOs, and I was shooting about 16,000 ISO, again, the raw images came out basically the same way that my Z9 images come out when I process in Topaz Denoise or Adobe Lightroom's Denoise AI. There are some important differences though. Well, obviously there's no grip here like you have with the Z9. As a result, although it fits my hand okay, when I go into the vertical mode, I'm in this kind of situation. I don't like that too much. I'm used to having that grip down there below. Now you can buy an accessory grip for the Z8. It does cost some money, of course. It will give you a little longer battery life because now you're using the two of those EL15 batteries instead of just the one that's in this. But it does actually make the camera actually larger than the Z9. So you go from a camera that's smaller than the Z9, which may be what you were going for in the first place, and now you have a camera that's bigger than the Z9. But at least you get that vertical grip. The only real difference I noticed was the frame rates are exactly the same, but the buffer on the Z8 actually fills up faster than in the Z9. And that caught me by surprise. Now, I'm used to with the Z9 being able to track the action and actually just banging out photos throughout the action as it occurs. With the Z8, I found I couldn't do that. The buffer would fill up much quicker, and I had to take my finger off because it would just stop firing or it would fire extremely slowly. And it would take several seconds for it to clear before I could really start firing again. And then I had to be careful about how many frames I took because it was still trying to clear that buffer. Now, after I got home, I ran some tests to see how the Z8 performed and the Z9 performed under the same conditions. Let's get to that right now. So to set up this test, I used the same CF Express cards in both cameras. Of course, the Z8 has an SD card. I can't really replicate that, but that's the closest I could get. They were both firing at 1,000ths of a second, 15 frames per second. I would hold down the shutter button until it would hit the buffer, let release. I would see how many frames it fired before it hit the buffer. And when it did hit the buffer, I actually started a clock to see how long it took to clear all the frames from the buffer. First test was raw only. I used lossless compressed because it's the largest file size. So raw only, lossless compressed. The Z9 managed to get 47 frames before it hit the buffer, and it took 26 seconds to clear. The Z8, on the other hand, made it to 30 frames and cleared in 16 seconds. Now we go to RAW plus JPEG, fine. Z9, 61 frames, 33 seconds to clear. Z8 only made it to 32 frames, not much different than the RAW only, and 17 seconds to clear. Finally, JPEG, which is kind of interesting. Pressed the button on the Z9, it just kept cranking, and never stopped. At some point in time, gave up, turned out to be at 369. It never cleared a buffer because it never hit a buffer. The Z8, on the other hand, it hit the buffer at 123 frames, 31 seconds to clear. Now, here's an important point, and what I experienced when I was photographing in that game. What would happen is when you do hit the buffer with the Z8, something interesting happens. And that is it drops to 1 frame per second when the buffer is reached, compared to the Z9, which still puts out about 5 frames per second, even as it's trying to clear the buffer. So that's significantly different. And that was the experience I got when I was photographing at this game. Is I hit the buffer, which with the Z9 is not, critical. You can still keep firing and have a decent chance of catching some photos at 5 frames per second. With the Z8 down to 1 per second, you might as well just take your finger off the shutter button and count at least 10, 15 seconds before you start photographing again, because it's not going to do you any good. Now, the Z8 by itself, body alone with a battery, is $4,000. It's $3,999 and change. This is US dollars, of course. Now, say you want to add that battery grip to get a good verticals. Well, now you're looking at another $349 and change. So let's say $350 in US dollars. Finally, you also need another battery. Well, those Nikon batteries are not cheap. We're looking at about $79 for one of those batteries. So if you add it all up, now you're looking at over $4,000, $4,423 before tax to be exact. Now compare that to a Z9 and you're looking at about $5,495 or about $5,500. $4,400, $5,400, there's about $1,000 difference between these two cameras with the grip. But you can also get the Z9 renewed from Nikon at a good value at about $5,000. So now you're only talking about a $600 difference between the two of them. So if you're a hardcore sports photographer, maybe you just spend the extra money. And say you're not as hardcore and you're just, an advanced amateur and you just really want to shoot sports, then maybe the $1,000 difference is well worth it for you in this case. Okay, so to sum it all up, Z8, still a great sports camera, not quite a Z9, but still a very good and capable sports camera that you choose to go that route. In my next video, I will do some settings that I prefer for the Z8, and I'll also update the settings that I did for the Z9 that I did about a year ago. I'll see you next time.